Hello, welcome to Socialist Action Webcast. This is webcast number 3 in the new 2024 series. My name is Elizabeth Weiss. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and the past Secretary of Toronto New York Region Labour Council. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the Indigenous Dano Arawak-speaking people began arriving 4,000 years ago. They were wiped out by the European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is the greatest propaganda lies. Our speakers are Flo Schade in Terrace, BC, SA Federal Secretary Barry Weisleder, and Ans Modlich in Toronto. We are living in truly unprecedented times. Some call it the age of mass misinformation, ripe with conspiracy theories and fake news. Many people who are deeply discontented with the capitalist status quo seek alternatives to the lying politicians and corporate executives. But this didn't start during COVID lockdown or in the decade preceding it. The ruling rich have been lying to us for hundreds of years. Why? To cover up their crimes against humanity and nature. The rulers have been pumping out propaganda galore to justify colonial wars and anti-labor repression. In fact, the terrible abundance of propaganda lies prompted us to convene this panel to explore the greatest propaganda lies. There's just too much competition for the top prevarication. There is just too much competition for the dishonorless, but it should be fun to consider some of the biggest whoppers and how the rulers do it. So our speakers will present their views for about 20 minutes each and then answer questions from the audience. So let's welcome our first speaker. Barry Weisleder is the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action, a leading member of the Workers' Action Movement and chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus. He served 3 years on the OPSU, that's the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, Executive Board. For many years, he was a delegate to Toronto and New York Region Labour Council. Today, he plays a leading role in the Toronto Coalition Against NATO and the Labour May Day Committee. Welcome, Barry.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And good evening, comrades and friends. The propaganda lie that I'm going to nominate as one of the greatest propaganda lies ever goes way back in my personal memory. It goes back to a time when I was just starting to gain political consciousness. 58 years ago, my bar mitzvah took place at the Shaarei Shamayim Synagogue in Toronto. To prepare for the occasion, I was required to go to Hebrew school every afternoon, which occurred after elementary school, and this for 3 years. The Hebrew school collected donations for the Israeli charity Keren HaKayemet, and it taught us that Israel made the desert bloom. It occurred in a land without people for a people without land. In time, I learned that the Zionist state backed the US war in Vietnam and sold weapons to US-backed dictatorships in Latin America. I learned that so-called socialist kibbutzim comprised only 3% of Israel's population and played a mercenary role. I learned that Israel was founded on lies. Not only the lie that Palestinian land was largely unoccupied, but the lie that 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes and villages during their ethnic cleansing by Zionist militias in 1948 because they were told to do so by Arab leaders. Then there was the lie that it was Arab armies that started the 1948 war, that saw Israel seize 78% of historic Palestine. The lie that Israel faced annihilation in 1967, forcing it to invade and occupy the remaining 22% of Palestine, as well as land belonging to Egypt and, in the case of Syria, the Golan Heights. Israel still lives on lies. The lie that Israel wants a just and equitable peace and will support a sovereign Palestinian state. The lie that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. For Palestinians, Israel is less democratic than apartheid South Africa, according to Bishop Desmond Tutu. The lie that Israel is an outpost of Western civilization in a sea of Arab barbarism. The lie that Israel respects the rule of law and human rights. According to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the civil liberties organization in Israel, and of course now the International Court of Justice, it does not respect the rule of law and human rights. The lie that security is the motor force of Israeli foreign policy. Israel votes annually with a tiny minority of countries at the United Nations to uphold the US embargo of Cuba. There is the lie that Zionism is the moral agency of the victims of the Jewish Holocaust. It is well known that the Zionist movement collaborated with the Nazis in Europe. There's the story of Adolf Eichmann and Robert Kastner in Hungary that I will mention later. Over the past 75 years, Zionism has turned Palestinians into the Jews of the Middle East. Is this not happening now to the residents of Gaza? Consider the original Zionist objectives. It was not merely to colonize Palestine, but to expel and replace indigenous population there. Zionism, from the 19th century through the 1940s, was a tiny minority movement among diaspora Jews. Socialism was the dominant trend, including revolutionary Marxism. Jews like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Karl Radek, Yakov Sverdlov, Maxim Litvinov, Lev Kamenev, and Moise Uritsky were leaders of the Russian Revolution. To say nothing of Rosa Luxemburg in Poland and Karl Marx himself in Germany. So, Zionism needed and sought imperial sponsors for the bloody enterprise of colonization and dispersal of the Palestinians. The European colonial powers wanted to exploit cheap labor and to acquire natural resources everywhere, including in the Middle East. Zionist leaders lobbied the Ottoman Empire, Imperial Germany, Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia. Labor Zionists, the so-called Socialist Zionists, played a particularly insidious role. Aaron David Gordon, founder of the Hapoel HaTzair, the Young Worker, and a supporter of Poal Zion, Workers of Zion, coined the slogan, Conquest of Labor, Kibush Avodah, which meant to displace Palestinian workers. They called upon Jewish capitalists, Rothschild plantation managers who got land from absentee Turkish landlords over the heads of the Palestinian people, and I quote, to hire Jews and only Jews, close quote. They organized boycotts against non-compliant Jewish businesses. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were 1,000 Palestinian villages, 1,000. Trades, crafts, textiles, and agriculture flourished. Palestinians welcomed Jews, as well as Armenians fleeing the genocide against them in Turkey in 1915. Arch-right-wing Zionist Vladimir Jabotinsky supported the genocidal Turkish regime. There was no organized Jew hatred in Palestine, unlike there was in Russia and Poland. In 1896, Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, proposed that the Ottoman Empire grant Palestine to the Zionist movement as, quote, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, close quote. In 1905, the Seventh World Zionist Congress recognized the threat posed by emerging Palestinian nationalism and offered to defend the Sultan's rule. When Germany made an alliance with Turkey, Zionists appealed to Germany. In 1914, the World Zionist Organization moved to enlist the British Empire, which aimed to break up the Ottoman Empire and seize control of the Middle East. Chaim Weizmann, said Jewish settlement would civilize the country and guard the Suez Canal for Britain. Along came the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917, favoring, quote, a national home for the Jewish people. Fortunately, there were another people already living there. Zionists claimed that Palestine was a wasteland, but also insisted that Palestinians be prevented from cultivating the soil. Now explain to me, if there's a wasteland and no one's doing anything, why should there be a ban on Palestinians cultivating the soil? Britain used colonization as an instrument for political control of Palestine. Weizmann's ally, General Jan Smuts of South Africa, boosted the Balfour Declaration. Herzl was a big admirer of Sir Cecil Rhodes, arch-imperialist. Remember Rhodesia, named for him? South African capitalists established Africa-Israel Investments to buy land in Palestine. The company still exists, by the way. Its assets are held by Israel's bank Leumi. Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, was explicit about the Zionist aim to expel and or decimate the Palestinians, whom he compared to the Aztecs and Sioux indigenous people. In his book, The Iron Wall, he expounds the doctrine of pure blood. Even the liberal philosopher Martin Buber affirms that, quote, our being is determined by blood, close quote. Compatible with European racist doctrines of the time, it is no stretch to say that Zionism is rooted in racism. By 1931, 20,000 peasant families were evicted by Zionists. The British Mandate government awarded 90% of concessions to Jewish capital, roads, Dead Sea minerals, electricity, ports, etc. By 1935, Zionists controlled 872 of 1,212 industrial firms in Palestine. The loss of land, jobs, and the increasing repression fueled a Palestinian uprising that lasted from 1936 to 1939. The British imposed martial law. There were many arrests, attacks, houses were blown up. 6,000 people were left homeless in Jaffa, which is just to the south of Tel Aviv. The British created a Zionist quasi-police force called the Colony Police, numbering 14,000 in 1939. A Royal Commission of Inquiry issued the Peel Report. It assessed the causes of the revolt stemming from a rise of Arab nationalism, increasing Jewish immigration, and land purchases. The failure of religious leaders, including the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the feudal landowners, and the new Palestinian bourgeoisie, their failure to support the revolt enabled the British and Zionists to crush the Palestinian rebellion in the late 30s. The Palestinian struggle in one form or another has been continuous since 1918, with civil disobedience, general strikes, boycotts, non-payment of taxes, and demonstrations, of course. Like other national liberation struggles in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Palestinian struggle demonstrates that the national bourgeoisie has no independent or progressive role to play in national emancipation. It is tied to imperialism and to neo-colonial regimes, such as the current Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza, for that matter. Only the working class, with the support of the poor farmers, is able to fight all the way for freedom. Only through socialist revolution can this fight mobilize the majority and win, just as the Bolsheviks did in Russia and the Castroists did in Cuba. This is the strategy of permanent revolution. Permanent revolution is counterposed to the two-stage revolution concept. It is counter to reliance on the bourgeois nationalists. It is counter to the disastrous two-state solution. When the United Nations partitioned Palestine in 1947, Jews were 31% of the population. 31%. The big imperialists and Joseph Stalin's USSR gave 54% of the fertile land to the Zionists. They voted to do this at the UN. Before the State of Israel was established, the Irgun and the Haganah, formed in 1920 to defend the Yishuv, the colonial settlements, seized 3/4 of the land and expelled almost all of its inhabitants. 385 of the 475 Palestinian towns were razed to the ground. By May 15th, 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were driven out. How? By terrorist actions. Recall the massacres at Deir Yassin, an operation headed by Menachem Begin, a future prime minister, then the massacre at Doima, then it happened at refugee camps in Gaza in the 1950s, at Kibbutz, October 1953, an onslaught led by Ariel Sharon, another future prime minister, and then at Kfar Qasim in October 1956. What do we mean by apartheid state? Is it an exaggeration? Well, in the first place, only Jewish labor is allowed. There is no leasing of land to non-Jews. The right of return, called aliyah in Hebrew, is for Jews alone. Jewish religious laws apply to marriage. 93% of the land belongs to the Jewish National Fund. And the most racist, exclusivist organization is the kibbutz, which mocks the notion of cooperation, much less socialist internationalism. Zionism and fascism always had much in common. The revisionist Zionist youth, Beitar, wore black shirts or brown shirts, which was Begin's preference, and employed the fascist salute. Basically, fascists wanted Jews out of Europe, and so did the Zionists. The Zionist Federation of Germany sent a message of support to the Nazi Party in June 1933. The World Zionist Organization defeated a resolution, 240 to 43 votes, calling for action against Hitler in 1933. The World Zionist Organization's Anglo-Palestinian Bank broke the international boycott of the Nazi regime, facilitating the purchase of Nazi goods and importing them into Palestine. Joseph Goebbels praised Zionism in a major report in 1934. Adolf Eichmann was invited to Palestine as a guest of the Haganah. Zionists were willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for the colonization of Palestine. As late as 1943, while the Jews of Europe were being exterminated in their millions, Rabbi Stephen Wise, leader of the American Jewish Congress, opposed any change in U.S. immigration laws to enable Jews to find refuge. Dr. Rudolf Kastner of the Jewish Agency Rescue Committee in Budapest, in Hungary, signed a secret pact with Adolf Eichmann to, quote, settle the Jewish question, quote, in Hungary. It sent 600 prominent Jews to Palestine and kept silent about 800,000 Hungarian Jews to be exterminated. On January 11, 1941, Yitzhak Shamir, the seventh prime minister of Israel, proposed a formal military pact between the Irgun and the Nazi Third Reich. Zionism's portrayal of the victims of Holocaust was the culmination of its attempt to identify the interests of Jews with the interests of the established order. Today, the Zionists...
Okay. 5 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Today, the Zionists join their state apparatus to the might of U.S. imperialism, including the covert operations of the CIA on all continents. Instead of seeking social justice and fighting the ruling classes, which cultivate anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews, including reactionary Arab and Muslim regimes, the Zionists curry favor from these reactionaries. And that includes the so-called Abraham Pact, headed by Saudi Arabia, which seems to be like on the ropes at the moment because of the catastrophe in Gaza, which has made them back away, given the opprobrium associated with Israel in that region. As the great Ukrainian Marxist, Jewish Canadian Ukrainian Marxist Leon Trotsky explained, the emancipation of the Jews is bound up with the fate of the world socialist revolution. Trotsky, along with renowned Polish Marxist Isaac Deutscher, predicted that the Zionist state would be a death trap for the Jews. As we can see today, Israel and its egregious crimes are a lightning rod for anti-Semitism. The antidote to anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. A particularly potent antidote are the anti-Zionist Jews, like independent Jewish voices, among whom I count myself. So I nominate the lie that Israel is a land without people for a people without land as one of the biggest propaganda lies ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Our next speaker is Schade, and she lives in northern British Columbia with her Wet'suwet'en husband and 2 young children in a place called Terrace, traditional territories of the Tsimshian peoples. She works as a poverty law advocate, holds a master's degree in religion and science from the University of Edinburgh, is the founding community organizer in the Schade Local Action Network, and is a leading member of Socialist Action Canada. Welcome, Flo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Barry, for another educational, informative presentation. Love hearing your thoughts about Zionism. So today, oh man, we really are spoiled for choice in terms of what could we possibly talk about. But I was thinking something that has struck me recently has been a lot of the propaganda that we see around China, xenophobia, and really just like a, drumming up of antagonism towards China that's really prevalent on amongst our political class of all stripes. So I wanted to take a look at that. And even with that, there is so much to choose from, just even in the last, year. Of course, we had the spy balloon incident, and I was thinking of going with that one, but that one was relatively quickly resolved because it came to light quickly that I think it was only a few months later that the Pentagon confirmed that there was no data being taken from that weather balloon that was not a spy balloon. And the other one that I wanted to look at a bit more closely today was the two Michaels case and the Meng Wanzhou incident. But there are others and they continue, so we will kind of mention those as well. But the xenophobia and the antagonism towards China is something I think it's worthwhile to look at in terms of why is it happening now. And I think, Barry hit the nail on the head there in terms of mentioning that it's always in service of justifying something else, some other behavior, some other action, atrocity, mindset. So that's the same thing in this case. So I'll just tell a little story, I guess. I was not aware of all of the details of this case and incident before I took a look at it. I don't know how familiar other people are, but I thought it was quite interesting. So if you recall, late 2018, around December, Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, which is, a leading tech innovation firm in China with, global market reach and access. She was arrested in December 2018 in Vancouver, Canada, at the request of the Trump administration because she had allegedly been misrepresenting Huawei's business relationship with a subsidiary that was Iran backed. So they were saying, oh, you lied to HSBC about your true business relationship with this subsidiary named Skycom, who is Iran backed, whatever that means. And therefore, Huawei is violating US sanctions against Iran and like Saudi Arabia. So Canada relented to that. Apparently, Meng had been traveling in a lot of other countries around this time. The warrant for her arrest was out in August 2018, and no other countries had relented to this global US warrant, but Canada decided that, okay, we're gonna go ahead and arrest her for an alleged crime that has literally nothing to do with, Canada. It was about a US law violation with another third party, HSBC. So really nothing to do with Canada. And that whole legal question is still contested. Kind of a similar context to the arrested and detention of Julian Assange. It's different, but the point is that like the US really has no jurisdiction or business even or authority to detain and arrest people in this manner, but they're still going for it. And the fact that the vassal countries are capitulating is troubling, but not surprising. So she was arrested late December 2018. being, you know, an important person in Huawei, which was even back in that time, if you recall, this is when Trump was really gearing up the trade wars, tariff and trade wars with China. He was threatening to rip up NATO, which put a big pressure, sorry, not NATO, but NAFTA, and some trade agreements, which put a lot of pressure on the Trudeau government. So anyway, so they relented, they arrested her. A few days later, then China arrests the two Michaels. So we have Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Then really the propaganda onslaught begins, because it's consistently they were arbitrarily detained. There's no basis for this. They were just apprehended. There's, you know, why is this authoritarian government doing this? We demand the return of our citizens. This is what all of the Canadian political class was saying. You know, Jagmeet Singh is on the record as well, defending Trudeau, saying that we demand our citizens back, that there's no basis for this. It's completely arbitrary. It's, you know, it was just spun into this whole thing about how it's just another example of the authoritarian communist Chinese government cracking down on innocent civilians and the innocent, you know, population. And look at us, how we're so different to them, even though Canada literally in that instance was violating international law and human rights by detaining Hmong in that way. But, you know, something's happening to my computer. But the narrative was very much put out there, and the framing was that because we, you know, Canada had lawfully arrested Hmong, now in retaliation, the authoritarian communist government of China has arbitrarily detained these two individuals. So that still, to this day, is still the framing of Canada, that they use this term consistently, arbitrarily detained. So that's the crux of the issue, because what happened since then? Okay, so since 2018, obviously there's just lots of sort of, you know, legal filings, evidence submissions of back and forth, but everybody's basically detained. Meng Wanzhou is detained in Canada. The two Michaels are in China. You know, there's much outrage farming over their conditions that they are under in China, light 24 hours a day with the lights on, you know, sleep deprivation, interrogation for hours. So there was a lot of, you know, outrage over this, deliberately. The years go by, you know, at the 1,000-day mark, all the politicians come out and say, okay, we demand the return of these detainees. But Trudeau had consistently been saying we're not open to a hostage swap because that would undermine Canadian judicial values or something like this. So it's basically in that pattern until, well, in 2020, both the Michaels were officially charged with espionage. China initially detained them under national security concerns, which I thought was kind of clever, because that is the blanket charge that a lot of you know, American or Canadian claims will be as well, national security. So they were charged with espionage in 2020. Of course, the Canadian government's all denied it. They denied it. No ties. They're civilians. They're arbitrarily detained. Okay, things progress in the case. By 2021, I think a deal was on the table. In any case, though, in 2023, I think early 2023, some sort of a deal is reached. The extradition charges are dropped against Meng Wanzhou. And even though, you know, according to both sides, well, according to China, this had nothing to do with Meng Wanzhou being apprehended. And according to Canada, it was just totally arbitrary. Yet, and nobody was going to come to a hostage deal. in 2023, some sort of a deal was reached. The Michaels were able to return, although they have been found guilty of espionage charges in Canada. They were allowed to return home. That's only happened I think less than a year ago. And Meng Wanzhou was able to return back to China. And then things really get kind of interesting, because upon returning, what we start to find out a lot more about the two Michaels. Who really are these people? All that we've heard in the media has been they've been arbitrarily detained. Michael Spavor is a businessman. Michael Kovrig is a diplomat. So we're finding out more about them. Long story short, turns out Michael Spavor threatens in November 2023 to go after Ottawa, Canadian federal government, and Michael Kovrig together for basically using him as an intelligence asset and implicating him in these crimes. And he was saying he got wrapped up into that whole thing and experienced everything that he did in China due to Michael Kovrig and the Canadian government basically conspiring to use him as an intelligence asset. And that's because Michael Spavor had a very close relationship with Kim Jong-un and the DPRK. So he actually had, there's photos of him on the yacht. They had a kind of friendly relationship. Michael Spavor's whole thing was he wanted to actually bring, I guess he wanted to sort of normalize relations with North Korea through business and entrepreneurship and tourism. So now Michael Spavor is alleging the thing that a lot of people had suspected, and that the Canadian government had explicitly denied and still denies, that there was some intelligence gathering and some spying going on. So what happens then, right? So Michael Kovrig, very interesting character here. When you look a bit more into his history, turns out he was working for Global Affairs and reporting for the Global Security Reports Program, which is a department in Global Affairs that's intelligence gathering, but not officially part of the intelligence department. It's like some weird kind of quasi-diplomatic intelligence department, which itself is very sketchy. So he's working there for, I don't know, 5-6 years, China public facing, China, Hong Kong, North Korea relations, takes a leave of absence, unpaid leave of absence, to take another job at this group called the International Crisis Group, which was founded by George Soros, I believe, in like 1995, with the intention of, it's basically a lobbying group, a foreign affairs lobbying group for the status quo, I suppose, or whoever George Soros, donates to in the Canadian government. So this is a very interesting development that was a fact that was, hidden from the Canadian public until basically the dust had settled and people had enough time to do investigations. Because the International Crisis Group is basically like, if you guys have heard of NED, like the National Endowment for Democracy, it's one of these organizations that are not officially part of the national security intelligence apparatus, but they're only one step removed. It's a private NGO. It's not, all they kept saying is, oh, he's not a CSIS agent. He's not a CSIS agent. So he doesn't officially work for CSIS. That is true. But he's worked for Global Affairs and he works for this like nonprofit think tank lobby, whatever, which is very common now. And I think, okay, yeah, it's one of the reasons it's an interesting story, because it shows a lot of the intersections of deceit, I guess, and obfuscation that happens, especially when it comes to the Canadian surveillance state and the extent of surveillance and intelligence gathering that's really rampant within our society. So it turns out Michael Kovrig had all of these ties that they considered Mr. Kovrig, CSIS considered Mr. Kovrig an intelligence asset. They keep referring to him as a diplomat, although he did not have diplomatic immunity when he was arrested because he took, again, I find this very strange, but he took an unpaid leave of absence to get another job, which is not very typical. So I feel like, and in his work through the Global Affairs Department, they made these reports, which have, it's all verified. Those reports get shared through the Five Eyes network. So even though they're not supposed to be part of intelligence, there's all of these, intersections where the global affairs and the, governing bureaucracy mixes in with like intelligence gathering and the sort of global political concerns of the, administration in power. So what's happened is basically in November when Michael Spavor threatened to sue Ottawa and Michael Kovrig for conspiring to basically use him as a tool, they settled out of court, don't you know? And I'm not surprised because this keeps all of the secrets, closed in a book. If they would have gone to court, a lot of the conversations and secrets would have come out about how connected Michael Kovrig is to the Canadian surveillance and intelligence state, and how they conspired basically to, in some senses, entrap Michael Spavor. But of course, because that out-of-court settlement happened, he got over $1 million. None of that is going to come to light. And just last week, they published another article, I think CBC, with again saying the arbitrarily detained. There's no reason why the Chinese authorities would have picked up Michael Kovrig. But of course, you just scratch a little bit under the surface and it's all there. Like they had a lot of reason to pick up Michael Kovrig, and they were essentially correct. I mean, they keep that one step removed, I think, through the International Crisis Group in order to have some kind of plausible deniability. Like, oh yeah, he's not a spy. He was working for this agency. But I think, as we all know, that's just not how things work anymore. And the propaganda is still ongoing on this one because they're continuing to hold that narrative line about China arbitrarily detaining, random citizens, when in fact, these two folks, and one in particular, as the actor, made deliberate attempts at espionage, right? He was gathering information about North Korea through Michael Spavor and Chinese relations. So, and I'll just wrap up by saying, it's interesting when we think of what purpose does that serve. And if you zoom out a little bit, I think it's very clear that the numerous issues and layers in all of the anti-China propaganda that we're experiencing right now is because the US and the West, Canada, just latching right onto US imperialism, are threatened by the, Chinese power, economic power, political power over the globe. And there's no way to really overcome that quickly. So rather than work on having the American Western society redevelop, they're just trying to strangle other economies and other nations from developing and showing an alternative model. So I will leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Our next speaker is Hans Modlich. Hans considers himself a dissident member of the NDP for 60 years. He spent 12 formative years as a member of LSA, forerunner of SA, was the last chair of Fair Play for Cuba Committee in 1968. An engineer by training, he was one of the first 10 Canadian minstrels for the chip technology revolution of the 80s. Experienced the German so-called reunification in the 90s, has become fully politically engaged again as the new Cold War is turning into Holocaust Take Two. And his quote, "My political beacon all along has been a young Ukrainian Jew whose parents sent him to German high school in Odessa at the cusp of the 20th century, the century of revolution betrays." Hans? You're muted. You're muted.
Now I'm on.
Yes.
Thank you. My participants have similar themes to mine. I would be on a ski chalet in Switzerland overlooking the mountain sunrise or sunset, whatever. And I would be talking to you in German if it hadn't been for the event that I consider to be the founding lie of current American capitalism. And I want to deal with the myth surrounding the Second World War. It's fed to us in high school as the great war of liberation against impending totalitarian fascism. There's a grain of truth in that. But as our co-thinkers in America went to jail because they opposed this war, and I'm talking about Joseph Hanson and Farrell Dobbs, who characterized this war as a class war, as an inter-imperialist war, as the globalization of the war against the working class. And they were the only leftist in America to oppose that war. They stood trial in Minneapolis with a little booklet called Socialism on Trial. You can read the whole record. So my talk is going to be on the origins, the myths surrounding the connection of Hitler with American fascism. First of all, that there was a strong fascist movement in America. How could there be otherwise? Because Hitler derived a lot of his racist ideology from America, from the Black racism, the eugenics movement, and the overall colonial outlook of America at that time. It's no secret that Hitler was an open admirer of Henry Ford, that the first machine guns for the SS were delivered by Remington, and that throughout the war, American capitalism maintained strong relations with the enemy. There's a book called Trading with the Enemy, and it goes much beyond trade. It goes deeply into the affinity that the ruling classes in Britain and America held with Hitler, whose espoused aim was to defeat Judeo-Bolshevism, a hyphenated word. And it was an escalation of the successful defeat of the German working class on a world scale. So everybody applauded Herr Hitler when he aided the overthrow of the Spanish Revolution and reached an accommodation with Chamberlain in 1938, whereby the British gave the Germans the green light to expand eastward to reclaim some of their territories that had been truncated from Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Another little booklet that is quite valuable here is a book by A.J.P. Taylor, a noted British historian, and it's about the origins of World War II. More specifically, there are other books. Patrick Buchanan is a right-wing Republican, but not as rabid or crazy as they come today. and he calls the whole war an unnecessary war. And the flashpoint, fast forward to 1938, the opening was the annexation, having annexed Austria, the annexation of the Sudetenland, which was the German-speaking section in the north of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia being what you might call today a multinational state, with a substantial arms industry, Prague being its intellectual capital, one of the first universities in Europe, period. But again, the claim of repatriating the victims of the Versailles Treaty, repatriating Germans, was the slogan that enabled Hitler to do this without direct arms force. So there remained in 1939 the issue of Danzig, as we call it in German, or Gdansk, and the corridor linking East Prussia, today's Lithuania and Kaliningrad, with the German mainland. And it is here that the newly minted Polish regime, emerging from World War I, seems to be extremely stubborn, resisting the obvious overtures of Hitler to join him in an alliance against the Soviet power. And going further and resisting the sensible demand to repatriate the city of Danzig with its 400,000 mainly German inhabitants. The incendiary part, to make it short, that Chamberlain, having been upstaged by the conquest of Sudetenland by Hitler, was enraged, and to forestall a similar loss of faith, he declared an unconditional alliance with the Polish generals that they would come to the rescue of Poland if the Germans invaded. First of all, the British were in no way, shape, or form able to enact this commitment, and it further hardened the stupid attitude of the Polish generals to refuse any concessions, legitimate as they were viewed by many circles, including the British, that they should concede Danzig to Hitler. To make a long story short, Hitler made a pact in August with Stalin on the opposite side, and they mutually decided to carve up Poland and large parts of Eastern Europe. And in June 1941, Hitler made his big onslaught into Russia. Having surprisingly vanquished the French in 1940, and having, with regard to the British, shown great leniency at Dunkirk, not taking 500,000 British soldiers captive. He kept an open channel to the British to join him in the conquest of Russia, in the victory over Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism. Now, Hitler was convinced that America, with its heavy fascist elements, would not join a war against him. That was his biggest strategic mistake. And to make a long story short, the war ended in Stalingrad in about 3 months before I was born, with the retreat of the Germans. On the way back, for instance, they armed the Ukrainian Waffen SS, which is currently in the news, through Jaroslav Hunka and others. But Germany was colossally defeated, and not without the American help to the Russians through the Lend-Lease program. The Murmansk Run, as it was known, was one of the highest casualty graves for Canadian seafarers, shipping some 14,000 airplanes and 18,000 American tanks to Stalin. Today, with the hindsight of Ukraine, we can describe this as a proxy war that the Americans let the Russians and the Nazis bleed each other to death or near death, while they were securing, like Colonel Bain in his little jeep, securing the choice industrial residue of the Nazis in 1944 behind enemy lines. The war, the D-Day landing, saved American lives, just as the Ukrainian war so far has been fought entirely with Ukrainian lives. 0 hour came, and the Potsdam Treaty and the earlier Yalta Accord had assured that Germany would be divided into 4 zones: British, American, and French, and Soviet on the other hand. And surprising to no one amongst us Trotskyists, the policies that were pursued in the Soviet zone were those of popular frontism, not of workers' councils, which did spring up in Berlin and in the industrial sectors. German industry, by the way, had maintained 38% of its productivity to pre-war levels. That compares to the Russian level after the Civil War of 14% of its GDP being preserved. So here we come to 0 hour, and the key aspect here is another book by a leading American scholar. It's called Drawing the Line by Carolyn Eisenberg. Drawing the line means dividing Germany. She describes the subtitle of the book as The American Decision to Divide Germany. And this is another one of the myths prevailing in Germany, that Russians divided Germany. No, Russians were primarily interested in securing reparations from a unified Germany because they were in desperate need of reindustrializing and reparations from the totally devastated Russia after the war, with 25 million deaths, civilian and otherwise. So it's interesting. For instance, I had a grandfather in East Germany who having denounced under Hitler his own son to the Nazis, was a chairman of the Christian Democratic Union in the East German puppet regime.
5 minutes remaining.
The property relations, thank you, were preserved with the exception of the land holding estates of the rich Junkers. They were distributed to small farmers, and above all to the millions of returning East European or Germanic East Europeans who had a guilty conscience after the crimes that the Nazis committed in Eastern Europe. And they streamed into Germany. They streamed mainly into the Western sectors. And this brings me around to the myth of denazification. Yes, some titularly prominent Nazis were indeed hanged or executed, but the overwhelming majority of Nazis were rehabilitated slowly or were able to get visas or backroom deals to get to foreign countries. One conspicuous example is the one of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the killer of the Les Enfants des Yeux, the 41 Jewish orphans. But the whole West German government that was shaped up had a judiciary that was almost seamlessly translated, even from the Kaiser days through the Nazi days. And they virtually escaped unscathed. I'll give you a little example here to pick up on Barry's comment about the Zionists. And this is a picture of Adenauer, the first German chancellor, West German chancellor, and Ben-Gurion. And it talks about German Leopard tanks going to Israel. Why did they go to Israel? Well, Adolf Eichmann was reported to have been discovered somewhere in Argentina, but it was the German Secret Service that knew exactly where. And the deal was made that the Germans would let the Mossad pick him up, provided that Eichmann would be tried in Germany. And of course, the Germans were very much afraid of such a trial because it would unearth other Nazi involvements at the top echelons of government. So the deal was struck between Ben-Gurion and Adenauer to hold Eichmann trial in Israel. And the reward were German tanks being shipped. Fast forward to, by the way, I have another couple of books linking the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Helmut Kohl was a protege of a SS commander in Prague who, after the Zusammenbruch, the collapse, presented himself as a displaced person. The only linking factor, exceptional circumstance, he had a suitcase full of dental gold when he arrived at the refugee center. And this Dr. Ries, as he was known, became a leading string puller in the galaxy of the German Christian Democratic Union in the 60s, 70s. And Chancellor, to make a long story short, Chancellor Kohl was one of those proteges. He proclaimed, of course, that he was too young to be a Nazi, but his mentors were thoroughly Nazis. And the paradox is that the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal and company never did point a finger at the then NATO member allied Adenauer regime. Would you throw this fucker in the garbage? I can't shut him up. Anyway, the Kohl, of course, was the unification chancellor. The reunification is another matter that I had some experience in, but I'll pause for questions. Can you make that one shut up or walk it out of here? Anyway, I think my time is up.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans. Okay, so we're going to open the floor now, comrades, for the Q&A. And I have only one question so far in the chat. I don't see any hands up, but people are welcome, even if they don't have a question, to maybe make a comment what they think their propaganda lies are. So, but in the meantime, while we do that, I'm going to go back to the panelists. with my one question that I have. And then you can take 4 minutes each. And if you don't want to answer this question, then maybe you might have another propaganda lie that you might like to talk a little bit about. So we will do it that way. But anyway, the question in the chat is this. Thanks for the presentations, everyone. This is from Zach Bunting. Flo, do you have any comments on the Chinese police operating at Chinese diplomatic mission news frenzy a while back? I haven't come across any good criticisms, but it's always appeared along the same style of spin placed on something likely much less sensational. So that's the comment sort of slash question. And I'm going to start with Flo and to Ons and then to Barry, and you can just add another propaganda lie if you wish. Go ahead.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I hadn't heard about that one specifically when it came up. I don't know about the other guests, but I did just Google a little bit, and it's interesting. There's a couple of things that came up. One about Chinese police stations in Canada and abroad. They're sounding the alarm about that. And then another one that the Chinese, the People's Armed Police, which is like a paramilitary kind of unit, which are armed. The regular Chinese police are not armed, I don't believe. That they were involved in some tactical like war games, I guess, with Russia, and then that was being described as diplomatic. So I don't know a whole lot about that specific claim, but I guess just from what I found, I agree that it's all the same kind of spin. And I think that's what we need to, we have a takeaway from today. I think it's those greater like patterns of how the propaganda is fleshed out and the spin and kind of what to keep an eye on. Because something that struck me quite a bit about a lot of the xenophobia stuff recently. And Nord Stream too is a really good example. But there's just been all these things that like very recently in like a frame of time that people can recall. So like within a few months, even a story will come out. There's some big massive issue and it's a huge crisis, and then a few months later, 6 months later, the quiet correction, the quiet retraction will come out. We saw this in Nord Stream, same thing as the two Michaels and the spy balloon, so many things within Gaza, the hospitals. They'll make these big claims and then quietly the retraction will come out. That's definitely a pattern and something I think we need to keep an eye on. And also just the weaponization of certain terms. And I think this is becoming more and more kind of critical as we enter this era of, I feel like it's basically propaganda wars, and that's pretty much it. Like, I'd love to hear more comrades' thoughts on this, but my general take on this stage of capitalism is that it has nothing real left to offer people. We're only going down, materially, in a real way. We're going down, and so they have to try to overcompensate with propaganda so that we don't feel so bad about how like shit things are going. And they are, and that's why if they can make us feel really angry at China and like things are even worse there and like, oh, thank God we don't live under the communist authoritarian regime of China. I'm not saying that China is doing all good, but that's not the purpose and the function of the anti-China propaganda that we're pummeled with right now. And I think, it behooves us to think critically about why they really want us to hate China so much right now. And I think it's to not examine the failures of our own economy and society so much.
Thank you, Flo. Okay, Hans?
Well, the whole mystique that America was fighting for freedom while hiring Nazis all around the world to carry on a Nazi war against socialism or colonial revolutions, was bolstered, of course, by the decision to unleash the Cold War. It was not through any act of aggression or revolutionary instincts that had long forsaken Stalin. Stalin was quite acceptable to a bourgeois Germany as long as he got his reparations. And the notoriety of the support for instance, Eisenhower legitimizing Franco's fascism, this all went by the board. All these people were cleansed of their past in the name of a Cold War against alleged communism that was going to conquer the world. Well, it had no such intentions. This came to a head, of course, when Gorbachev finally recognized that he had no defense against the smarts of a cruise missile. And that led to the détente, the disarmament agreements between the two powers. And as soon as the ink was dry on that and the wall came down, America again reasserted its claim for Pax Americana, to be the unipolar master of the world. And it did so in the first American Gulf War against Saddam, allegedly having invaded Kuwait under false pretenses. So the naivete of Gorbachev to pretend that he was still in a disarmament stage, that lasted only brief years. And by 93, 94, the Clinton administration, we had the beginnings of the new Cold War and a breach of the promise that was made not to expand NATO was now proceeding somewhat slowly initially. But we know that history through the recent example of the war in 2008 in Georgia, and of course the subversion of the Ukrainian neutralist regime in 2014. That story was told, so I don't think I need to go back through that. But America has been living in a fascism soft regime. It has been able to create the mystique that we have democracy, whereas in reality, in America, we have a plutocracy, and that was cemented with the Citizens United Act in 2010, when money was the only limiting factor as to which of the two parties was going to occupy the White House.
1 minute remaining.
So now the new American enemy image has shifted to China and Russia. And the only spanner in the works now has been the Gaza episode, and with it, the unmasking of Zionist fascism, to call it by its right name. It's leading to a profound crisis of credibility among the Western European and American ruling classes. And that is the crisis that we're facing now.
Okay. Larry?
I do have a few comments, although we got only one question, but I can riff on that for a bit. You know, there's just so many lies that if we did take on the task of awarding a prize for the biggest one, I think we could be debating this until the cows come home. It's just incredible. So I'm just going to touch on a few examples, a few cases. First of all, Canadian foreign policy. The big lie is that Canada is a force for democracy and peace in the world. I'm referring to the Canadian state, not to the average Canadian. And we had the pleasure of doing a book launch with Eve Engler, who's the author of now 13 books on Canadian foreign policy. This is the latest one. Canada's long fight against democracy. And I want to urge everyone to go out and buy a copy of this book. You can connect with Eve, or you can connect with the publisher, or you can perhaps even read sections of it online. But it touches on so many examples of how the Canadian state, the apparatus of the big banks and the oil monopolies, have interfered with local democracy in Iran, Colombia, Guatemala, Congo, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Indonesia, Ghana, Greece, Uganda, Chile, Peru, Russia, Haiti, Palestine, Honduras, Paraguay, Brazil, and it's all documented. It's the table of contents. You're not going to be able to see that, but you can arrange to get the book. So that's the first point I want to make, that the big lie lives comfortably in Global Affairs Canada, and should be spotlighted. Secondly, the big debate now, in the major mass media, is about the carbon tax, and the Liberals say the carbon tax is our best hope for reducing carbon emissions and saving the world from asphyxiation and depletion of nature. And the Conservatives under Poilievre say that we can't afford it, and besides, it's not the answer. But they don't say what their answer is. The truth is that carbon taxes do not significantly reduce carbon emissions, significantly, and considering how close we are to climate change that is irreversible and catastrophic. The carbon tax is just a cynical maneuver by the Liberals so that they can claim to be doing something. And they say in the next breath, yeah, and 70% of Canadians are going to get back the money that they are paying in higher fuel costs and so on. The truth is, the working class needs to make a decision. Do we want to control the producers of the emissions, or do we want to, burden consumers with the task of confronting this threat to humanity and nature? Of course,
1 minute remaining.
big business government is not interested in controlling the producers, because that would be a violation of property rights. So the carbon tax is another big lie. And we revolutionary socialists were against the carbon tax, but not for the reasons that Poilievre falsely asserts, because we want to control the producers of the emissions and not the hapless consumers who have very little choice in the matter, who need to drive a car to deliver that pizza or to get to work at a great distance because they can't afford to live in the big urban centers. The third lie I want to mention, I've only got a minute or two left, is that...
Oh, you got 30 seconds left.
Okay, even better news. The new Democratic Party is not democratic. The middle name is completely misleading. The policies adopted by the NDP, if they are to the left of center, are completely ignored after a convention. And what's worse, candidates are selected by the top brass and cannot survive being vetted or even survive being democratically nominated at the local level. So the contention that the NDP is democratic is a big lie, which those of us who are involved in the party and in the labor movement on which it is based know very, very well. And on the next round, I'll tell you why the ruling ideas in every epoch are the ideas of the ruling class.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I have 2 questions that was in the chat, so I'm going to put these forward now. So listen carefully, panelists. The first question. Presently, Canadian mass media, and this is from Kerry. Presently, Canadian mass media, primarily on the right, trying to ask who is paying for the Palestine protests. I think it is a desperation of capitalism to demonize social justice movements through manufacturing lies. How shall the left movements expose such lies? Question number 2 from Maria Aline. I have heard from different people that the problems we face currently, locally, and in Canada are caused by the fact that Canada is turning communist. I don't understand it. Maybe the speakers could help me understand the matter. So you have 4 minutes to answer one or both questions. We'll start with Ons, then Barry, then Flo. Ons?
I'll stick to the first question by Kiri. Who is paying the Palestinian protests? And I'll throw back to 1968 with this picture. And it shows Fidel Castro on the top, Hans Modlich from the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and Joe Young for the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. It's a totally brazen lie by a journalist tipped off by the RCMP, allegedly, Peter Worthington in the Toronto Telegram. And me being a poor student at the time had not the resources to fight back. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee at the time had already been discredited by the Kennedy assassination lie, the same deep state assassination that gave us the death of his brother, and of course, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. It's a travesty that these lies have never been exposed who were the real killers in 60 years passing. So surely the system's going to try every handle to try to smear what is a legitimate uprising among racialized Arab, Muslim, and other minority groups who see themselves being persecuted victims just alongside the Palestinians. I'll leave it at that. There are some other lies that I'd like to explode, but right now, one last tidbit. To get back to the Ukrainian Nazi Yaroslav Hunka. On his 99th birthday, sometime in February, 99th birthday, he was awarded by his native region in Ukraine with a prize of the collaborator of the arch-Nazi Bandera. His name was Strelko. So he got a Strelko prize for being a good Nazi collaborator in the throes of World War II, in the face of the slap in the face that the Hunka affair caused worldwide for Canada. The Ukrainian regime saw fit to resurrect Hunka and give him a medal. By the way, Canadian Dimension has an expose of how the Deschênes Commission laundered the open SIF that Canadian immigration in the post-war period offered to displaced refugees from the East, including many so-called Volksdeutsche, the same people that I referred to earlier, having retreated with the defeated German Nazi troops looking for an escape somewhere, and Canada offered a willing cover for them to dive under.
Thank you, Ons. Barry?
Yeah. Who these are so funny. Who is paying for pro-Palestinian protests? Well, the short answer is no one. In fact, to the extent that there are banners and placards and flags and leaflets distributed at those protests, they're produced by volunteers who donate their blood, sweat, and tears, their own cash to generate these items. I know from firsthand experience because Socialist Action has been selling. You see this button I'm wearing? End the occupation, free Palestine. We've sold probably 2,000 of those, and we had them made by order. You know, providing the design to a manufacturer, and we make like maybe 10 or 20 cents a button, just to enable us to make more buttons. So it's just stuff and nonsense, but it's a function of the anti-democratic animus of certain people in the major media want to argue that. So it's getting back to political reality, how to expose the media lies, which have been so evident against opponents of the war in Vietnam, against the current genocide in Gaza. The answer is simple: demonstrate. Demonstrate in the streets, mass action, because for many years, protests against the war in Vietnam were completely ignored in the mainstream media. It was only when they reached numerically into the hundreds of thousands and the millions was the mass media forced to cover the huge Vietnam anti-war demonstrations. They responded a little bit quicker to the pro-Palestinian mass actions that have occurred worldwide for the last 6 months. But that's only because of the speed with which the movement grew, and also, the internet. People can watch while they're demonstrating in Toronto or Guelph or Kingston or Ottawa. They can watch millions of people in the streets in Jakarta, Indonesia, and in Jordan, in Egypt, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Mexico, at the same time on their phones. So it's hard to suppress a lot of this information, and so they try to vilify it in other ways. Is Canada turning communist? I mean, as a teacher of social studies and history, it makes me laugh and cry at the same time. Political illiteracy is such a sad thing to see. It's such a sad thing to see, and it shows why socialists, we have our work cut out for us. We got to explain what is communism, what is socialism, what is capitalism, what is liberal democracy, and how shallow it is. It's a dollar democracy, as the great American socialist James P. Cannon labeled it. It's a dollar democracy. Democracy exists for those who have the dollars. In the 1950s, health scientists said we should put fluoride in the water, in the main water supply. But the ultra right wing denounced this as communism, and the scientists and progressive people said, no, fluoridation is to reduce tooth decay. No, they said, the anti-communists said, no, you're trying to control us. You're trying to force this evil fluid down our throats, literally. But it's just crazy. So when people don't understand what is communism, that is, it's the stage of social and economic development that supersedes socialism. Socialism is a cooperative economy, a cooperative commonwealth economy where public ownership predominates in the major means of production, and everyone is paid according to their labor, and all their needs are met. Under communism, you've basically virtually conquered scarcity on a world scale, and you're operating on a far higher level of development. But we have to get there by decommodifying society before it's too late. And I was going to say a couple of things. How does the ruling class get away with the lies that we've heard described here this evening? And
30-second remaining.
And many more can be added. Well, the ruling ideas in every epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. That's what Marx and Engels said, 150 years ago. And it means not that ideas determine the mode of production, but the mode of production and who controls it, ideas that predominate. But if we're going to break the grip of the ruling class and stop the lies that they use to preserve their wretched, toxic system, we need to outmobilize them, and we need to tell the truth on a much larger scale. And that's what we're determined to do. Thanks.
Flo?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, great questions. Okay. So I'll just start with the order that they were in. Curious question about how do we sort of expose? Sorry, I'm just looking for it. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, who's paying for the Palestine project? The mass media is right-leaning. Yep. So what I thought of when I read that question is, again, another very important, I feel like, to recognize pattern, tactic, strategy in state propaganda, which is projection. And I didn't realize this really so clearly, probably until the Gaza genocide, but also, you know, actually doing my own personal work and unpacking your own trauma, sometimes you'll find how like projection, I didn't really, now that I can see it, I'm like, damn. So I hope that other people can maybe like take that into account. But I do find that like, and not just any kind of subtle projection, like straight up diametrically opposed lying is a tactic, because you really think it's beyond most people's comprehension, like regular comprehension, to believe that somebody would say something diametrically opposite to what is happening. And that's kind of like gaslighting too, right? And we see that a lot. And this, it's just funny to me that the now the right is accusing the left of being paid for their protesting. Why? Because there's a very credible, you know, proven, like we know that APAC and whoever, CJA, they're literally paying students, college students, to incite these rallies. There was recently when I saw they were paying students to reenact Hamas rapes, like they're reenacting October 7th. Like they got to pay people to create their AstroTurf movement. So I think that's kind of where that comes from. So basically any allegation that you see thrown out, check to see if the opposite, or if they're at least that's one of the strategies I employ now. I remember like projection. I'm like, oh, okay. Is that because you're actually doing that thing and you're trying to throw people off the scent? And it's become, it's scary how accurate that is. Like really, I think we have to take that into account. So there's that side of things. And how do we, you know, expose that? Kind of tying into all the questions. You know, I agree with Barry that there's critical mass of people. And then there's also, again, like what you said, Barry, about the internet, alternative media. I think another strategy for us to push against the propaganda is supporting and uplifting independent, alternative, leftist media whenever we can, creating content as we do, and trying to get hooked into these, you know, discursive worlds where these debates and arguments are happening. So, you know, it's good for us to be part of that world and to push back. But I mean, it's also an economic critique, because this also flows from the concentration of monopoly in all sectors, including the media, which allows them to have a real stranglehold, you know, on mass information. So whatever we can do to kind of push against that monopoly, I think will be helpful. Okay, 1 minute. And then on Maria's point about this is actually such a good one, so I hope we can discuss a little bit more. But yeah, the whole, you would not believe how many people in this world think that Justin Trudeau is a communist, like straight up. I know.
Yeah.
And I still laugh at it, but then I'm like, whoa, man, like that's literally the belief that a lot of that's like a core belief that a lot of people are framing their understandings of the political realm over, and it's quite disturbing. So all I'll say on that is that, again, another thing that I found to fight sort of propaganda and to have a good critical lens on is to recognize that anti-communism that I found, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this, but anti-communism is the absolute strongest thread that weaves through all of these different propaganda initiatives, whether it's the Hunka, you know, debacle and the Nazi, or Zionism, and the covering up there, or China. Like, if
30 seconds.
If it serves a function of demonizing communism or an alternative model to what we have now as, capitalism, then they will go against it. And I'll just wrap up by saying it's probably scrubbed now from the internet. I don't know, but I remember right around when the Hunka incident happened, there on CBC, no less, they had a historian talking about who said verbatim that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, Western countries, including Canada, were more interested still in defeating communism than defeating Nazism. And that's basically what informed all of their steps moving forward. So I think that's a really good lens to apply because that's all roads lead back to that. The capitalism cannot have a serious challenger as an economic model, or it will be undermined.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. The speakers list is now closed because we are running out of time. And the last question is, any comments on the lies around how the economy operates? So we'll start with Flo, then Ons, and then Barry. And you have 2 minutes each.
Okay, well, Zach, it's just not fair because, where do I begin? Clara Mate's book is good. Maybe I'll just lay out what I have heard from other, heterodox economists and things that I have understood to be true now since learning about it. But basically, that the field of economics as we understand it today, that's taught as the mainstream sort of orthodox model, is itself a propagandistic system that founds a lot of claims and understandings about how the world works, how money works, how trade works. That's actually not based on reality, but that's based on theoretical models, which, coincidentally happen to also produce results that reinforce the status quo, that reinforce the system as how it is. And if people want to learn more about that, I'd say look into understandings of what neoclassical economy is and heterodox economics. But there's a lot there. And I'd say that if we start de-propagandizing ourselves on the economic level, we will open ourselves up to a lot of other critical thinking in other social areas as well.
Thanks, Flo. Hans?
Well, the biggest lie, of course, is that socialism doesn't work. I think that sums up what Flo was getting at and what the questioner is getting at. Now, when I lost my job as a cable engineer, having been smeared by the Toronto Telegram as laundering money from Castro to the Vietnam thing, I locked into a technical career, which culminated of working as an automation engineer for Intel in Canada, Eastern Canada, the French part more specifically. And I rapidly came to the conclusion that information technology was not the right word for the new chip technology, because while Gutenberg, who invented the printing press, replicated information, the chip itself was capable of replicating work, robotics, and the whole thing. Now, the party line from Intel came, well, what do you say to people saying their jobs are threatened by automation? You say, well, we're working on a leisure society. Now, I knew by that time that that was a big lie, but that was the allegation, the defense. At the same time, of course, capitalism gained tremendously in productivity, but it was never shared. Now, you can't build socialism in a destitute country or a third world colony. You do need to build it where the productivity is the highest. And you can truly rely on a leisure kind of society to bring out the best of people's capabilities and productivities. So yes, socialism entirely capable of drawing on these resources if it's implemented in a democratic, ground floor, bottoms up manner, free of bureaucracy, free of war economy, and so forth. It's a foregone conclusion that the productivity is there in agriculture, you name it, in farm ecology and so forth. But we are deflecting all that into war and into ecological disaster. So that is the biggest lie that we have to combat. And in the way, we have to start with the anti-war movement.
Thanks, Hans. Barry, 2 minutes.
I'm still crying and laughing about political illiteracy. How does the economy work? Well, let's just say there are at least three discourses here. Number one, liberals, large L or small l, you take your pick. They say they're trying to balance competing economic interests. That there's, big labor and there's big business, and only the liberals will get it right and make sure that there's fairness. But the foreign policy never changes. And in fact, the capacity of business to charge the prices that it wants, that it thinks it can get away with charging, and be able to conduct business without putting all the goods and services completely out of the reach of millions of people. That reality is something that the liberals don't really want to recognize. And still they claim they want to balance interests. Conservatives, especially the new Polyev conservatives, the former Reform Party, reincarnated in the Conservatives, and now the People's Party, which is a little bit more extreme in this direction. They say, what is their project? Their project is to free capital from the chains of state control. By the way, Brian Mulroney let this open this Pandora's box with the trade deals and with his efforts to get legislation off the backs of big businessmen. They want to free capital from the chains of state control to enable competition to work. When has there been any meaningful competition in the economy for the last 100 years or longer? But I'm just going to give it a conservative estimate. Just the last 100 years. Late capitalism is not based on competition. It's based on monopoly control. And when there's a need to develop a product that capital doesn't want to freely invest in, the state comes along, usually liberals, but conservatives as well, and they'll say, well, we'll fund half of it or 3/4 of it, and you can control it all once you're safely, you got production underway. When Galen Weston appeared before a parliamentary committee recently to answer questions about price and profit inflation, and he was said, and I think Jagmeet Singh or one of the NDPers said, aren't you ashamed of all these mega profits that you've been achieving at the expense of the ordinary consumer? And his answer was, no, I'm head of the board precisely to achieve this result. Of course, our business is to make profit as much as we can. That's how we can continue to do business. So, there it was, nakedly, for all to see. Capitalism and democracy are incompatible. Capitalism and competition are incompatible. Only a planned economy in the interests of the vast majority can save humanity and nature from destruction that is posed now by the toxic world capitalist system. Together we will win. If you agree, please join us in Socialist Action.
Okay, thank you, Barry. And thanks very much to our panelists, Flo, Barry, and Hans. And of course, special thanks to Kiri, our technical producer, and Barry again as the political producer of the series of webcasts. And thank you to all the comrades who joined us tonight. And hopefully, those who didn't, you can tell them about it, and they will go on Socialist Action YouTube channel and watch it because it will be put up there in the next day or so. Also, if you would like to, become a member of Socialist Action, you can sign up at our website www.socialistaction.ca, or you can mail us, send us a letter to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just give us a call, 647-986-1917. Future essay webcasts are to be announced. Likely they will occur on oncoming Thursday evenings every 2 weeks or so. So keep in touch by joining the essay email list and by visiting the essay website. And also, another way to learn more about essay is being a supporter of Socialist Action news reports and the Essay Monthly magazine, the Red Review, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca, and you can keep up to date on all current events and other things as well. But in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, and stay active. Bye for now.